This is Tom Hoffarth, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
We get to do cool things around here. We're talking about Tom and his wonderful book called Perfect Eloquence, and it's about appreciating the life of Vin Scully from a bunch of professional folks who knew him. And by the way, joining us, and how cool is this, is Vin's nephew and my friend Dan McLaughlin, who writes professionally himself. So we thought we'd have who better to join us than someone who professionally works and writes, but also knows Vin in a family sense. And Dan has been on talking about his uncle before, but I thought that'd be a great addition to our conversation. Hey, Tom, welcome to the show, and thanks for coming on with us.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be on with both you guys. What a treat.
Yeah. So Dan makes your book. You mentioned him, but I guess you guys weren't able to connect to actually get something that he wrote at all in there. But I know that you got, what was, I guess, how close did he come into making your book? Was there a disconnect, or how did that happen? Let's start.
No. The problem was a deadline and not knowing him, and just not. It was just a lot of figuring out. Most of the people, almost all the people who are in the book, I've known in some sort of way. And when I did the chapter about Vin's love of patriotism and history, I was able to reference the 9/11 connection and why that was so important to him when he came on the air when baseball resumed about a week later and gave this tremendous presidential type speech to welcome the people back to the game. And so I guess it just didn't dawn on me to reach out. And this is why this is so fantastic, because in this really tight deadline period I had to do this, it was a scramble, and I had to cash in a lot of chips. So it was interesting who responded, who said I can't do it, who said I wish I could, but I can't write, so please interview me and we'll do it. So that's really why there was no disconnect. It was just really no connection to start with. So connecting now is sort of the residue of this whole great project, and seeing it just as a starting point. I think there's so much more to do with this.
Yeah, and for those of you who haven't read the book, I mean, it's a delightful book. It's also, for me, it's always a little weird to read any book where most of what's in the book is stuff you know, because you're sort of hunting for the things you don't know that are new to you, and there were quite a number of those there. But I mean, Tom has the perspectives of, I think, a tremendously broad-ranging group of people here, right? I mean, you've got the people who worked behind the scenes with Vin, people in the booth, the ball players, the owners, umpires, writers, and, as well as people who knew him through his church, and so it really is a great sort of 360-degree view of him. I was watching a thing, because I'm at National Review, a thing about Bill Buckley, our founder. And somebody, I forget if it was Milton Friedman, it was one of the big people, said that, he actually thought that Bill's greatest talent was for friendship. And I came away from Tom's book really feeling that was so true of Vin as well, that so many people felt like the most important thing to them was how he was a friend to them.
And it was because he gave him his time. And when you read I think the thing that weaves through all of this is that he gave me 10 minutes. He gave me 20 minutes. I didn't expect that much. And that, if that's the only takeaway you had, because you've already felt, if you grew up in Los Angeles, that you knew him as a family member anyway, just because his voice was part of your daily dialogue. But when you got those minutes or times to spend with him, either in the press box or on the field or in church, especially in church, for me, that was my kind of inroad. It was phenomenal to realize that the time was really what he gave. And if I were to do a eulogy, which is basically what this book is about, if you could do a eulogy about what you took away from Vin Scully, what would you say? And that would be the value of time, and not to fear death, and to appreciate life. And I think all that was entwined in his DNA, in his religious life, in his family. And so that made him so much better a person than it was a broadcaster. And that, to me, was really important to let people know. He might be the all-time greatest broadcaster, but to me, so many people realized he was such a greater guy and a person to be around.
Yeah, and I mean, the one thing that that I said, and one thing that I've always told people, and I think it also comes out in this book, is that, you know, you really see that the private Vin was exactly the same as the public Vin.
The eulogy thing comes across well because as you read the book, the Vin that you know expands. You get all these different perspectives, and like Dan said, across all these different relationships that he has, and you want to aspire to be this guy. It's not just now his work happens to be important for a lot of people. If you do some work things, it's not what you want people to talk about in your life. But Vin's work is such a part of all of our lives. It actually is true in his case. But this person who he was, you find yourself thinking, like, I could never hope to be, such a wonderful person, so giving, so gracious, and doesn't want to write a book. You talk about that in there as well. You really nailed that part. And there are other things that can't even make, because the book can only be so long. I recall, and I could be wrong about this, but my dad was big Sunday mornings into the Hour of Power. We're a Northern California family, but every now and then, Tommy Lasorda for sure, would be on there, and I would be excited to see even glimpses of Dodger people on there. And Robert Schuller had that kind of pull. Now, I can't 100% sure say that Vin was on there, but Vin was so present. I believe that I saw him on there. And so you have this presence that is bigger than just Southern California and gets out into this bigger sphere through a variety of channels.
Yeah, we all had a reverence for him, but not at arm's length kind of reverence. We all felt like he was comfortably part of our lives, daily lives. And it would just be funny when I was just thinking about that when you talked about that. I was down on the field once talking to Oral Hershiser, and he looked up at the booth and he said, "Oh, I got to go. The Pope is here." Because, he wanted to go say hi to him. But that was, in some people's eyes, it was like a papal visit when you could see him. But his door was open. If his door was open, you could come in and just sit there. And I would just sit there sometimes and just marvel at, just watch him do his work, his preparation. Again, that was another part of his being that you wanted to emulate. You wanted people to know that he didn't just show up half hour before the game. He was calling his wife on the phone 45 minutes before the game, and he was still being connected to everything that was important to him. And then it was just watching him do his work. Sometimes Sandy in the booth too, she would come and it would just be this great atmosphere that it wasn't pushed off, like, hey, I've got this ego, just leave me alone. I'm really hard studying. I don't know how he did it. And the one time the example I even have right in the beginning of my book is we happened to be at a game where we had friends that were in a suite, and my mom was there, and it was her birthday, and I just popped my head in the press box. I said, "Hey, Vin, my mom really wants to meet you." "Yeah, for sure, bring her in." So he did, and they had these lovely pictures together of her just like looking him in the eye and saying how much she appreciated him, and Vin has this aw shucks kind of look on it. But he gave everybody that time, and that was just so phenomenal that she'll always remember that. And that's the thing, is I had all these stories myself, but I wanted to tap into other people. Did you get this kind of thing? And they go, "Oh yeah, but here's some more." And one person led to another person. Peter O'Malley said, "You got to talk to Bruce Fremming. You got to talk to these Bud Selig." And so it became this quick snowball. And if not for a deadline, I'd still be putting this book together, and we'd probably have 300 essays, and we'd, be coming out in 2027. But we really wanted to get something out as soon as possible, because I think in what I was thinking about was John Wooden touched a lot of people's lives here in Los Angeles as well. And there's maybe a dozen books done about John Wooden from different people's perspectives. Like, here's what I learned. And so I thought if this could just be like the first of many, this would be great. If the family's happy with it, that would be great. It would be complimentary, and let's just see where it goes. And I'm just glad it's out there.
Yeah, one of the interesting lines in there that made me think a little bit too. And first of all, I mean, as you talk about his preparation, my years of practicing law, I always used to tell young lawyers, it's not what you know, it's what you can lay your hands on, right? Okay. Like if you're up at a podium, it's what's in your head, and then what is immediately in your grasp. And so much preparation goes into condensing all the stuff you might know into the things that you might need, and then knowing. I think you talk in the book about Red Barber emphasizing to him in his early years the importance of not blowing through all your material in the first inning.
Yeah, that was from his first producer, who's still alive at 96 years old. So he was great to reference.
Yeah, I was amazed at some of those folks who are still around. But one of the other things that I was thinking about, you talked about sort of, his broadcasts didn't have really, I mean, he had a few favorite phrases that we all got to know, deuces wild and whatnot, but he didn't really do catchphrases in the game. And at the same time, when people think about the catchphrases, right, like, pleasant good evening to you all and pull up a chair and everything, that's all from the pregame ritual, right? The pregame is ritual. It sets the stage, like getting into church. It sets the stage. Okay, we're going to say the same thing we said yesterday. It'll get you in the mood for Dodger baseball. And then the game starts, and the game is no longer a scripted ritual. Now we're doing something else.
Yeah, but that was the best part, was one of the things that Bob Costas has said. When he got, as a kid, he got a transcript, a book that had the Sandy Koufax 1965 perfect game transcript. And he thought it was a written document, not realizing that Vin had delivered that live. And so many people probably think the same thing. But all those things, whether you say you rehearsed your ad libs, I don't think he did. It just was that's what was true about it. It was authentic. It came from his heart and his head, and it just came out as a poet would say it. There's so many great lines about Henry Aaron's 715th home run and all these moments, the Gibson home run, which are great because they timestamp everything, and they put a caption on a picture that's always going to resonate in your memory. But it was those other things that came between innings. Nobody could weave in a story in between 3 outs and 1 inning than he could, and that was just phenomenal. People try, and it's a lost art that you can't even attempt, especially now with the time clock and everything. But just seeing pictures of people in the crowd, like one of the essayists was one of producers of the local broadcast, and Vin flipped the script basically, where the producer is usually the one picking the cameras, shots and things, but in a Dodger game, you had to follow Vin's storyline. So you found the pictures that went with his stuff. And it was just because it was that intimate one-on-one relationship. And that's another thing that probably will never happen again. It's that lost connection that a viewer has with a broadcaster, because it felt like a singular experience.
Yeah, and by the way, I had as a kid, and I think still have on my shelf back here, that same book that Costas is talking about, the Baseball Reader. He probably had an earlier version than I had, but I mean, we probably had that book in part because it had Vin in it. As a kid, we would watch golf. We were not golf people. My parents did not golf, right? Like, we watched golf because Vin was covering the golf. But he could make it interesting, even if you were not a golfer.
Because he played, he knew how humble you had to be at golf for it to be an experience. That these professionals who we were watching were so phenomenal, they could make these shots. But when they couldn't make a shot and they became human, Vin really made them human as well. And that's, to me, golf was maybe the most interesting sport for me to watch on television that he was doing, because I know golf is such a weird mishmash of cuts and cuts and cuts. And there's not that constant flow of a baseball game, but just the stories he could tell from his own experience of playing golf and getting in the mind of a golfer, and as a baseball player, because he played himself too. So those were really, I think, key resources for him that he had to pull from all the time.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting, some of the stuff in the book about just the differences in how a golf and a baseball broadcast are arranged. And I think he really did. He loved doing golf.
Yeah.
I think the only sport he ever really expressed any dislike of broadcasting was tennis. Tennis was not his pace. It was not his, it didn't fit with the way. The way
but the beauty of living in Los Angeles, I think, during that time was that you were accessible to people who were doing game shows and movies. And because a sportscaster like him had to think on his feet a lot and be conversational, they made it was easy transition for them to do these kind of shows, even a talk show that I tried to do once. So again, that was a chapter maybe I didn't even think about when I was doing, but most people were talking about how he could have been all these things in Kansas City or Milwaukee or something. But the fact that he was in Los Angeles, has a star on the Walk of Fame, and still is so humble about it, always projected the spotlight otherwise. That was, to me, like the perfect example of how how your humility and your true character comes out. And golf was always the sport that your true character comes out. And I would have loved to play golf with him, just because even I think a couple people would say if he'd missed a putt and he'd say something and he'd go, "Come on, Vin, you can curse. It's all right." No, it's not me. It was just like such a perfect thing to experience. So different parts, different people see him revealed in different ways, and that's the beauty of sort of piecing this puzzle together.
Yeah, I mean, I actually had the experience for the first time because we just happened to be up in Washington Heights, and I didn't really. My parents didn't, they grew up there obviously, and didn't much want to go back, and I think neither did Vin, but we were up there for an event, and actually went back to the Incarnation, the school and the church.
Oh, wow.
Where Vin and my mom, went to school and went to mass, took their sacraments and stuff. And it's a very old, dark, old school church. The school actually literally has separate entrances for boys and girls. It's got like this very, very old timey, old timey working class immigrant Washington Heights, which it still is. It's just different, immigrants from different places, but the same, neighborhood sensibility. And I think in a lot of ways, Vin became this great Southern California institution. And I think there was still a lot of like sort of quintessentially New York things about him. That just having grown up in that world of being where you're just constantly shoulder to shoulder with people who, are from different ethnicities and different faiths, different politics, and root for different baseball teams. And you had to sort of just roll with it all.
Yeah, that is funny to some people that he grew up a Giants fan, and I think there was a great chance he could have been the Giants broadcaster when there was some movement back then. But how lucky for Los Angeles that the Dodgers even moved and became the soundtrack that really pulled this city and this region together, because it's such a diverse region. Every part of Los Angeles so different and so culturally interesting, interweaved, but he was really the one that kind of knitted it all together.
Yeah, that story about the Nationals almost becoming the LA Nationals and just the machinations within New York, and how I always say like the Dodgers are one of the crown jewels of Southern California. It stabilizes the region. People are still mad about Chavez Ravine and all that whole thing. Imagine if the team sucked for the last 70 years. Like, it would be a totally different outcome. And they don't have a stabilizing Vin around to look at and revere. You have a turnstile of announcers and bad GMs. Who knows?
We even have that. We have that now in Anaheim with the Angels, right? And it's the Angels at some point decided the only way we're going to succeed is if we become the Dodgers, or at least we borrow their employees, and they started pulling Buzzy Bavasi and Red Patterson over there. And I think they had probably considered trying to hire Vin to be their broadcaster at some point, but he was so loyal at that point to the Dodgers, he had already turned down an offer to go back to New York and work for the Yankees in the early 60s. But that would have been some coup if the Angels could have pulled something like that off.
Yeah. I love the story about from Steve Dilbeck about John Vukovich throwing the ball to Vin. That's just these are those ones where you're like, I've known a lot about Vin. You hear a lot of the same stories, and it's great to hear the different points of view. But totally original story for me to hear that. I don't know if you guys had heard that story before, but
I hadn't heard that one. I hadn't heard a lot of stories, because he would tell them at certain times when you were having dinner, before games, and so you just had to be in that circle, and something would spark it, either a day or an incident. And he would do it on the air a lot too. But to me, the great part was Ned Colletti, the former Dodger general manager, telling him that he had bought his golf clubs that he'd put up for auction. He goes, "They're going to stay in the family. They're going to be family heirloom for us." And but that's just, you had everyone had a different connection, and that was the beauty of putting that, sharing these stories again. And I hope everyone sort of learned a different story too from reading it.
Yeah, I mean, I had not heard before the story of how he called the end of the 1984 World Series, like under the desk.
Oh, with Tiger Stadium with sod flying at him. Yeah.
Yeah, same. That was a new story too.
Yeah. So it's a book about sharing stories, but also about why those stories still resonate with you. Because the example of the 1984 World Series, where it was like it just showed his professionalism. You would have never known he was in that sort of dire circumstance. Just like the great story too about when he was one of his first games on the roof of Fenway Park press box doing a college football game. You'd never know that he left his jacket back at the hotel and was suffering through all this insanity. But because it never was about him, it was always about just getting the broadcast done right.
Yeah, and that was, I think, also part of the kind of the ethos of his generation too. The idea that you're not supposed to complain about things, and you're supposed to expect that things will go wrong on you, and you'll just roll with it. So,
yeah.
But I guess that's part of having the faith and that belief that whatever happens is going to happen, and you just have to sort of roll with it. And to me, the best thing he always would say was, if you want to make God smile, tell him your plans, because nothing ever goes according to how you want to do it. So it's just a matter of how you react to it. What's your character? How do you go with the fact that for the last 3 or 4 years of your career, the local Dodger broadcast is basically blacked out in Los Angeles because of this horrible business dispute, and he never once complained on the air that, you know, it would be funny to be in the press box with him when he's doing something and he would say something and go off camera, go, so I don't know who heard that, probably nobody, but it's just, that was just the deal he was dealt, and he made it work. But that was a lot of people at some point unplugged DirecTV, and they got Spectrum and Time Warner, and they said, I can't miss these last few seasons. This is incredible. The Dodgers would let this happen, but it was just the business of sports was probably the right time for him to just say, all right, I'm getting out of this. I don't want to be a pawn in this. And he went through a couple of different ownerships at the end too, that just made it even more difficult for him to deal with. But that's just the way it rolls. After the O'Malley family left, he was just, you know, being parceled out to different things, and everyone wanted him for TV or radio, and it was just a different business.
Yeah, and that was also, I think, a kind of, and there's a generational aspect to that too. But yeah, I mean, he had such a family feeling with the O'Malleys that he obviously never had with the other owners. But he always had a sense of, you know, that no matter how kind of big he got, he was an employee. They were the boss, and like, you know, like there's a certain humility that comes with, you know, reading the Farmer John's Meats copy on the air and such. It's just a sense that, like, okay, that, you know, this is what pays the bills. You know, maybe it's Schlitz, maybe it's Farmer John, but it's, you know, whoever it is that your sponsors are, that's, you know, you gotta sing for your supper.
Oh, it was, yeah. In the beginning, it was cigarettes and beer, and then as the Dodger Stadium was trying to be built, it was oil. And so, and that's kind of an interesting thing. That's now the Dodgers are still connected with Union 76, and people are wondering, is that a fair partner to be in this time of, you know, the world? But Vin was so connected to 76 and Farmer John and those things because of his the trust that he had with the audience. And Mark Langell, the team historian, tells this great story that if not for Union 76 demanding that Vin keep doing their ads, they would not have kept as a sponsor. So maybe Dodger Stadium doesn't get built. And so if Dodger Stadium is the place that Scully built, maybe there's a connection there too.
That's the thing, right? The public wants there to be private funded stadiums, but you don't want to, like, well, but don't have that person pay for it. Like, well, you know, at some point we have to give something up. Right? Yeah. Right. So the Jim Hill story was great. I love that, partly because right towards the end of Vin's career, DJ Severe, who's the DJ for the Dodgers, everybody, he became a friend of ours, and so we were invited and given press credentials to come and do a podcast right from DJ Severe's little perch, and it was great. And so we got these credentials. We got to park up like in the Vin Scully parking lot area, which is right there. And so like we walked maybe 100 feet and we were inside the stadium. Wonderful. And I'm like, oh my God, we can make root beer floats, which goes to Jim's story. And, you know, Jim is mortified because he turns around with his root beer float and spills it on Vin, and Vin just blows it off because Vin is impenetrable in his wonderfulness. So John, my partner, he and I go to the bathroom at one point, and there, using the urinal between us, is Vin Scully. And I'm like, oh my God, we're peeing next to this legend, because any encounter with Vin is amazing. And so, we're just doing all our pregame stuff. We're just hanging out because we're enjoying. We've already done our work, and so now we're just kind of like tourists in the press area. And John sees some amazing things. By the way, it's Frank Sinatra night, so Frank Sinatra Jr. is there to sing the national anthem or whatever. And John goes, "Hey, Pete," and he does one of these, and he turns around and he absolutely elbows Vin squarely in the chest. And he's like, "Oh my God, Mr. Scully," like this national institution. He thinks he's killed him.
I don't want to break him.
Yeah. And John, by the way, has a black belt, right? And so he's like, "Oh my God, Mr. Scully." He grabs him by both shoulders, and Vin's like, come on, kid. I'm not that frail. And then kind of blows it off and just walks into the, and so we even have our little story of just how, it wasn't a gentle bump. It was pretty severe. Vin can't be bothered, just completely blows it off. And it's just an amazing thing where all these stories just fly around him.
And he loved to listen to stories too, because us in the press box, the press box today is so different. But back in 80s, 90s, earlier, we would all the press box, all the reporters were pretty friendly. We're always jousting and we're putting each other down. And he would come in there and he'd be right in the middle of it, just because it was this friendly banter. And I remember me and another sports writer talking much about the Beach Boys that just appeared at Dodger Stadium and opening ceremonies. And we're talking about our favorite Beach Boy songs. And Vin is just standing there, just listening. And we almost felt like, oh, I think he wants to say something, but we're so involved in our own conversation. It was like, "So Vin, what do you know about the Beach Boys?" Or, we just wanted to include him in whatever was going on. And I think that the thing that still strikes me the most is that when the team still does this, they have a Sunday morning Catholic mass at the stadium, so that mostly it's for stadium workers can go in 9 a.m., 9:30 before they work. And Vin would go there. Sandy would go with him sometimes. And when he would just get up there and do the Bible readings, New Testament, Old Testament, it was phenomenal that you just want to pull out your phone and start recording it, because this was like the voice of God reciting God's work. And it was that's where you got the visiting team members who would come and listen, would stay longer and afterwards. And I think, like Father Willie Raymond wrote in one of his essays, like, "Can you believe that we just heard that?" It was just because it was so beautifully sounded, because it was so lyrical. But the more I think about it, is the Bible is really a book of stories, and Vin, being a storyteller, could tell these stories in a way that had a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so it made sense for him, and his strength was telling stories that here's a whole book full of them. And it was just such a wonderful thing to experience.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing that I always told people, and a number of people say the same thing in the book, was that, one of the treasures was getting a voicemail from Vin, because anybody else just leaves a message, but like even a voicemail from Vin had a beginning, a middle, and an end. Like it had a structure to it. So
when you'd see him call, you'd go, "Don't answer it. Let him leave a message," and then call him back.
Oh, I thought you were going to say something else. Okay.
Oh, no,
yeah.
But on top of those things too, like you said, the voice message, but note cards were also incredibly important to get from people, to get from him out of the blue. You didn't know that something you'd said or wrote resonated with him, and they were just phenomenal to get in the mail, and the penmanship was outstanding.
Yeah. So let me just plug the book here real quick. It's called Perfect Eloquence. There it is right here. I bought it. You know what I always say? Buy two, read with a buddy. And this is not just a Dodger book. This is a book about just how to be a gentleman, how to conduct yourself, how to speak publicly. If you want to learn about all these things and the attitude, especially from that generation, the people that we all look up to, this is it. This is a Bible of just how to speak, how to conduct yourself, how to write letters to friends. There's a lot of lessons that we've started to lose or have lost completely because these folks are passing away or have passed already. So highest recommendation I can give. I've really enjoyed it. A lot of great stories that make you smile from people who, if you like sports, you're going to know a lot of these names. So definitely get that. There's the link down below. See if I can point to it right over there. And it's called Perfect Eloquence. Definitely get that. So let's get back to chatting about this book. So some of the stories don't make it in, and you can't make this thing 500 pages, like you said. So what do you do with those stories? Do you write another one of these books? Do you put them on the internet? What do you do?
Yeah, I started a website. That was when I had to do an epilogue. I said this has got to continue because this is going to keep inspiring stories. So I have a website called VinScullyAppreciationBook.com. There's already some readers who've contributed things. One even contributed a note card that he got. There's an essay that I have up there from Jeff Lasky, who was I got to know him when I was covering minor league baseball, and he was the broadcaster of minor league team here in Los Angeles. He grew up in Los Angeles. Great, and Vin influenced his method of broadcasting. But it's an interesting essay because it was almost he had the curse of Vin Scully. People thought he sounded too much like him, and he was trying to do an imitation. But it's like, how can I help but not do that? If you read Jim Murray as you're growing up in Los Angeles, you want to write like him, but you can't because that's so original. So what Jeff had to kind of go through was accepting the fact that he took away Vin's greatest quality as his broadcaster, to be a reporter and not biased and not a homer, but also the fact that he had to sort of find his own voice. And that was a real struggle for him as he ended up going into different mediums at San Diego TV anchor reporter, and now he's in a whole different line of work. So to me, that essay is up on the website now because it's another example of how Vin can absorb you maybe subconsciously, and how Vin's advice to everyone was to be authentic, to find your own voice, because he didn't listen to other people, he said, because he didn't want to imitate them as well. So as more people read this and contribute essays, I want to kind of give them that platform and see what happens with more and more people responding to it. So hopefully they can find that website. The link is the address is in the book at the end. But I thank you for sending Dan's essay that he wrote when Vin passed away in 2022, because again, that added some great insight. And I wanted to ask Dan too about that. If you were to give a eulogy, was that pretty much what you would have said?
Yeah, I mean, literally, I sat down. I got the news and just sat down overnight until 3:30, 4 in the morning writing. And so it was pretty much what I had to say. What I could say and what I had to say.
Sure.
And there's always a little bit of a when it's family. You sort of want to give people, on the one hand, open the door and say, here's a little bit of the private stuff. And on the other hand, be able to say, look, like, this is my uncle, it's not my dad. They're, sort of immediate family stories that aren't mine to share. So I wanted to give, what I could, the stories that were my stories to tell.
I hope there is a good family project coming out of this, whether it's photographs and things to share, but you don't have to share everything. You just have to sort of, I think, validate. And I think that's what I was trying to do here is you again, what Steve Delbuck wrote in there too, the fear of meeting your heroes. Don't meet your heroes, you'll be disappointed. But in Vin's case, you were even more amazed at what a great person he was. So hopefully we can stay connected with still the storytelling, and the story. Vin's storytelling doesn't work just on a broadcasting point, but it affects writing and so many other movies and podcasts and everything else too. So he's really taught us a great example of whatever he processes through his education, whatever he learned to do through his work, it had an effect on all of us. And with Jeff being that example of, maybe you have to just sort of be careful what other people think of you, and maybe ignore it, but acknowledge it, but process it and see how it goes. And to me, that's that essay itself was such an interesting example of how this can affect not just him, but probably other people who get the same sort of thing in other cities. So I wanted to kind of set it off and kind of use that as to open a discussion. And I include this back and forth discussion that Jeff and I had with that, and why I decided not to put it in, because it was kind of excruciating in some ways for him to admit this. But I didn't want that to be something that deterred from the whole book's process. So.
Yeah, I mean, one story I remember Vin telling, and this again goes to his a certain amount of humility, but also his sort of interest in reflecting on how these things go, being in the public eye and speaking. was talking about. I think you mentioned in the book about when he did the Kennedy Center tribute that he was doing, and in the mid '80s, and he's he's backstage. And he's like worried about, I'm speaking in front of all these like dignitaries and stuff. And Vin is, frankly, in my view, probably the greatest public speaker of the 20th century, frankly. But he's nervous and he's worried about that. And he looks around and I forget who he said it was. I think it might have been Carl Reiner. It was somebody who was there to do like a tribute to Mel Brooks or something like that. Anyway, it was one of those guys.
I think it was Danny Kaye.
Yeah. Well, no, wasn't it?
Oh.
It was somebody else was doing a tribute to Danny Kaye, or Vin was.
Okay.
I think Vin was there to introduce Danny Kaye. So
Okay.
somebody else who was introducing or tributing someone else.
Okay.
But anyway, who's backstage at this thing. He's like, and he looked like he was going to throw up. He's like, he was like, so nervous, like flop sweat and everything. He's like, and then I watched him go on stage and just, pull it all together. And it's a reminder of how these guys, like the showbiz guys, like, even when they get into a situation, they may be nervous, but the habit of performing was kind of, it just kicks in and you get on stage and
that reminds me of a story because the Southern California sports broadcasters have an annual banquet where they award best this, best that, and everything. And Vin won best broadcaster every year. And it was so funny. Sometimes he would win the award and he goes, I'll just put it in the closet with the other ones. But he got up and got an acceptance speech, and I had to get up after him and present the next award. And there was movement going on because Vin was going to leave. And as Vin is walking out, I just go, this room is full of such great people, but Vin, he was such a hard guy to work with. Oh, he was just, you guys really don't know how we and I start going on and on like this, and the room goes quiet. And I go, oh, they're not getting, this is, sarcasm but so I go and I just finally kind of went off and somebody at the end said, oh, I got what you were trying to do, but it just fell flat. It didn't work. So I told Vin later, I said, hey, after you left, I did this whole thing. And he goes, yeah, you got to learn to read the room. And he told me this story. Of course, it led to a story. I was in school one day and I was telling something to the class and the teacher called me out. And it was like, there's always a great lesson to learn about, falling on your face. But it was just funny how I thought I could pull this off and just people just didn't get it. But I'm not a public speaker, so it didn't make it. I couldn't sell it.
There's also that great story about him closing out as he walks out when he wins that award. And he talks about all the great people in the room. And then he makes that joke about how he always votes for himself. Just walks out with the award. And it's just because, he had that timing. One of the things that's true about guys like Vin, DJ Severe as well, is when you do the math, like day for day, these guys perform before the biggest live audiences in the nation, because day in, day out, there's 40,000 plus. That's nobody's pulling more people in a large setting like that. And so they do get past the nerves, they do learn a calm. Look, I'm a combat guy, so I use combat as a lens for a lot of things. When you've seen a lot of those things, time slows down and that pressure drops. It's still important. You still know what your job is, but you learn how to work in that kind of tense environment. And so someone like a Rob Reiner, who has worked in front of live studio audiences, he can get there. Maybe he's got to be nervous first, but someone like Vin does learn to this is a normal thing. And I do think that you learn to perform at a higher level because you're no longer worried about the people in the audience. You're worried more about this is my job. I know I'm prepared. I don't have to worry about that anymore. Now I just have to go perform.
Yeah. I saw him twice in a live major theater type of place. It was the same theater. It was the Nokia Theater in LA. Once when he was on stage with John Wooden for a TJ Simers event, which I had TJ write about that in the book. And Vin was just so gracious he revered John Wooden. So Vin was always sort of reflecting the attention to John, and he helped kind of push him out on the stage in his wheelchair and everything. It was just such a sweet thing to watch. And the other time was during an ESPY Awards in 2016 when he was being given Lifetime Achievement Award. He again got up in front of all these sports people. I don't know, 4,000 or 5,000 to 6,000 people in this theater, gave a great acceptance speech, humble and everything else, and then just walked off the stage, arm in arm with Bryan Cranston. And it was that again was such a sweet thing. And it just reminded me too about the speech that he gave at the Baseball Hall of Fame. You know, we accepted that what I mean, that's poetry there. That video is another thing to transcribe and just admire. And Dan, you said you were there, right, for that?
Yeah,
He's
yeah.
in the
I mean, that
video.
was one of the all-time highlights of my life, obviously being like, 10 years old. And I mean,
Yeah.
we're in the hotel, my dad goes down to like have a beer at the bar with Vin. He's like, he comes back, he's like, yeah, we were drinking with Frank Robinson. Like, like what, I'm literally I'm on the bus to the ceremony, and and they stop, they're picking people up, right? So like, Warren Spahn is getting picked up there, and the bus is full, and Vin of course booms from the back like, oh, there's always room for one more left-hander, right? So like, I end up literally, I was like sitting on Warren Spahn's lap because we had to make room for it, but it was like, it's just like absolutely surreal at when you're 10 years old to be and as obsessed with baseball history, because I knew who these guys were.
Sure.
Right? But yeah, I mean, reading the room too. I mean, it was a brutally hot day, right? And Vin's speech was so concise. And then you had Happy Chandler, who got up there, and the former baseball commissioner. And as my dad put it, you never give an old politician his last microphone. And he talked forever. It must have been 45 minutes, but and then the last speech of the day, kind of the one that people were there to hear. I mean, people wanted to hear Vin, and they wanted to hear Frank Robinson, but they were really there to hear Hank Aaron, right? Who was the headline. And to this day, I don't know. I wish if I had ever met Hank Aaron again, I could have asked him, because Robinson gave a pretty long speech, and it was not a bad speech, but because he was on after Chandler, people were already melting. And Aaron gets up and he thanks people and he sits down, and that was all he did. I mean, it wasn't a short list of thank yous. He had a lot of people to thank, but Hank Aaron was a guy during his playing days. He was very quiet, right? But once Aaron was retired, he was a very opinionated guy.
Sure.
He had a lot to say, and I kind of feel like he probably had something he wanted to say that day in his speech, but he didn't say anything. All he did was thank people, and like you could see his parents, Hank Aaron's parents, right? So they're not young people, and they're from Alabama. They're used to the heat, but they were suffering up there. Like we all envied Robin Roberts, because he was the one guy who thought I had to bring really dark glasses, and he just tilts back in his chair. You could see that Roberts just dozed off in the sun during the whole thing. But everybody else up there is like, all the other Hall of Famers are all mopping their brows and everything.
Well, and it's interesting. I think since then they've changed the format where the broadcasters now do it Saturday night indoors, and the outdoor thing on Sunday is just left to the players' induction. So, in fact, that was probably a treat that you got to hear Vin do that speech. But it was such an eloquent, another tight, perfect way to sort of thank people and thank everybody at the same time without trying to miss anybody. And it's just a wonderful video to watch.
Yeah. What I think about Vin's career and as it got towards the end, I'm a fan of all the California teams. I mean, the Dodgers are probably a go-to team, the A's, but then all of a sudden I'm like, but I like the Padres and the Giants too. And so my Giants friends get mad at me for wearing a Dodgers hat. I'll remind them that there's a plaque, honoring Vin at the press box, at the Giants stadium. And his last 3 games there, it was Vin's air that broadcast the Giants game. And so when you have that kind of respect for someone who can jump across rivalries and have that kind of honor, I mean, I don't know of another announcer that's ever had something like that, where his air was the opposing team's call. That's amazing to have that level of respect and camaraderie, like, hey, we've done this for a long time together, they're sibling teams really. And Vin's originally a Giants fan.
They were together in history for a long time, just like Vin was together in history with Willie Mays doing his whole career and having Willie there at the end. And just to see Vin turn into a little kid again and just be, oh gosh, I can't believe this is Willie Mays with me in this booth. And he takes his hand and he rubs it over that plaque. So Willie, with his poor eyesight, can at least experience what the plaque's about. And those are just treasurable moments that we just want to embrace. And then, but look at what they reflect. It's again Vin's actions. He was more interested in how Willie was going to experience this event than he was, and it was just an easy thing to do. And one of the great pictures and essays I have in the book is from Dale Marini, who's used to be an admissions person from Loyola Marymount. And Dale has a great picture of his son waving to Vin in the press box that the Associated Press photographer happened to caption. And it was, again, it allowed Dale to tell the story about meeting Vin and his daughter, Kat, and admissions and all the stories that Vin would say and say, come up and meet me. And I mean, what a remarkable story that, again, I just sort of stumbled over when I was trying to do some research. So if I had stumbled over Dan's essay, I would have reached out to him right away, but I'm so glad I can have it to read now.
Yeah, the Dodgers put out a book too, and it's much more of a picture book. So it's really not, it's got some old essays and stuff, and but it's more for the photos. But my big axe to grind with that one though is that I think you got New York. They didn't get New York. They like half the things in there talk about Vin grew up in Brooklyn. One of them even, it might have been like a Tom Verducci essay. One of these literally says like, Vin grew up in Brooklyn near the George Washington Bridge. And I'm thinking, you have clearly never been to the George Washington Bridge and to Brooklyn if you think that Brooklyn is near the George Washington Bridge. So,
well, one of the things too that I had heard, because I wanted Dodger people to get involved in this, and I wanted family members to get involved, but if they didn't, I understood. But when Vin passed, like almost right away, the LA Times came out with a book kind of honoring him, and it was a bunch of essays and it was a bunch of stories that had been written about Vin over the years.
Yeah, it might have been the Times book that I'm thinking.
Yeah, the LA Times. Yeah. So, and then the Daily News, the company I worked for, they put their own book out, and it came a few months later. So it almost looked like it was a little opportunistic, but I understood the intent. It's like, let's celebrate the man because we have all this great collection of work, and it's what you do right now with great sports writers or anything. You put their book of analogy together, anthology. I'm sorry, the anthology together. So when I saw the book that my newspaper put out, there might have been 24 stories in it, but I had like a third of them in there. And I thought, these aren't even my best ones. And I don't even have a choice of which ones I want to include. I've got some better ones, I think, that I want to sort of put out there. So that was another thing. Like, I want to get some of my stuff out there. I've got 2 or 3 boxes full of interviews and tapes and pictures and things that I'd collected over the years. Never know what I'm going to do with them. And as I just sort of sifted through them, I found the common themes, and the funny things were this conversations we would have off the record and things like that. I mean, I had this great phone conversation with him maybe 6 months before he passed, and he was just telling me about how he's just loved to sit at home and watch soccer games. And I was like, we started talking about, could you broadcast soccer? Oh, no, I don't think that. I go, you'd be perfect. There's all that dead time. How do you make a 0-0 game exciting? Oh, no, I don't know the nuances, but I just love to hear the broadcasters have these hushed tones and love to say the word Harry Kane is now advancing the ball. And so he was just really getting into that sport, which to me was awesome that he was considering, the how you break down a broadcast like that. And we could talk about all kinds of things that were going on in the world too. And talking about baseball was almost the last thing he wanted to talk about.
There's a great essay by Ken Korach in there towards the end. He's an A's announcer. And I think Vin asked Ken, hey, he sees Kurt Young. He's like, what did Kurt, and I don't know if he did this on purpose or not, but what did Kurt Young do in the World Series when they played the Dodgers in '88? Because all Kurt Young does is give up a double to Oral Hershiser, who that day blanks the A's over 9 innings. And Oral has 3 hits. All he allows is 3 hits to the A's. But this is the kind of stuff that Vin had at his command, because he would have prepped for that, and he probably wouldn't have brought it up to make fun of Kurt Young. But he does have that ability because he had that just giant history and his preparation to recall, like, last time Kurt Young stood in this mound or whatever, and he would have some kind of incredible story. And I don't know that we have enough of that anymore. It was one of those things that he was great at.
Yeah, you can't fake that, and it's all personal experience. And I thought there was another great story. Keith Olbermann wrote this great piece for I think either Esquire or GQ when Vin was retiring, and it was a game. It referenced a game that Vin was doing in Philadelphia, and I was, as a media writer, we're always looking for things broadcasters say, and does that lead to a story? And what? So Vin he came back from a commercial break, and Mike Scioscia was up. Mike Scioscia wears number 14, and he referred to him as Hodges. And so you go, what is Vin losing his mind? What is he thinking? And so to get to the story is what happened. Why did you call him Hodges? He goes, well, during the inning break, there was a trivia question about Gil Hodges, and I was just thinking about Gil, and I looked down, there's another left-handed guy wearing 14, and probably just came out. And then, but what Keith wrote was perfect, because as Vin was explaining what happened, he goes, maybe I was trying to bring Hodges back. He goes, if only if it was that easy, to bring someone back like that. And so again, Vin gracefully explains a mistake he makes, but also sort of puts that punctuation mark, that last thing. God, if it's only that easy, we could bring someone back that quickly. But you have to, you have so much history and reference in your brain that of course those things are going to happen, and they rarely did. And if they did, he had a great support staff that would say, hey, in the last inning, maybe you can explain this a little bit better. So he was always open to people not correcting, but at least explaining, hey, maybe there's the listener might not have understood that. But that Gil Hodges story, and having Gil Hodges Jr. write an essay for me as well, was really important, because Gilly had a lot of great stories about seeing Vin in church and about introducing. I think the great story I think that Gil Hodges Jr. had was how his son was in the press box on a stadium tour and introduced himself to Vin, and Vin couldn't believe this was Gil's grandson. And what a connection, because that was at a point where Gil was still up for the Hall of Fame, still getting reconsideration, and Vin was the greatest champion of getting Gil included in the Hall of Fame. And it was just so nice that Vin and Gil's wife lasted long enough to see that happen.
Yeah. Dan?
Yeah, and I think he always did have I think he would have resisted being asked to name a favorite Dodger player. Because he had so many connections over the years and so much reverence for Koufax.
Sure.
But I think he there's no question he always had a special place in his heart for those early Dodger teams when he was, young, when he was maybe a little closer in age and closer to the players, closer physically even to the field.
Sure.
You have some stories in there about Ebbets Field, and there's no question that Gil was very high on that list, at least, that he just, it's also that everybody who came in contact with Gil Hodges felt that way about him too. Somebody like Tom Seaver would talk about it.
I could see it, but that was the great part about too, when they made a small documentary sort of convincing the Veterans Committee why Gil Hodges is a great candidate. And they have this clause in there that's character and personal standings matters as far as what, if you're using that against Pete Rose to keep him out of the Hall of Fame, why can't you use that for someone like Gil Hodges to put him in the Hall of Fame, considering all the other statistics that he had? So, and then considering managing the Mets, the Miracle Mets. So there was such a great body of work that it made more sense to use him as an example again of character, and why character is a reason why you should be in the Hall of Fame. And to have Vin sort of endorse Gil for that at the end was just so poetic again.
As we prepped for this, I not only read the book, but I listened to a bunch of older games, and it's just a riot to listen to just how baseball has evolved, how close those guys were. Like when the ball comes ripping back and it hits the chicken wire or breaks through the chicken wire, like, oh, that one went up into O'Malley's box. Holy cow, hope he's okay. And you can kind of hear them all turning away from the mic as they look to see, this whistler go whipping back in there. And it's just, I encourage anybody to go listen to those old baseball games if you really love baseball, because it's still just great to hear those old. It's baseball. It's fun. It looks funny because nobody looks like they're in great shape. They're all kind of wearing those flannels, almost kind of like they're dressed up in a suit, but it's just flannel. And it's just, I don't know, it's just a lot of fun. So I just encourage everybody to do that. I also encourage you all to grab Perfect Eloquence. Get the book. I'll put the link up here. That's a big thing. All right, so we got a couple minutes left. What do you guys want to wrap up on? Dan, what essay stood out in particular? Is anything left to cover with that?
I I mean, there were a bunch of them. I mean, it's sort of interesting for my generation of baseball bloggers, because I mean, I'm really kind of out of the baseball blogging business. I only write about it occasionally anymore. But it was sort of interesting to me that John Weisman got kind of the last word in the book. Who was somebody who was doing Dodger Thoughts back when I was doing the baseball crank blog. I thought it was also interesting. I think it was Will Leach. That I mean, again, I've talked a little bit about my piece about how Vin kind of at a certain point became sort of an ambassador for his generation, from the past. As the number of men of his generation actively in the public eye was declining. And I think Leach kind of touched on that, on the sense that even sort of the kind of political standards that guys like him would apply, that they just wouldn't apply that to Vin and his kind of old timey patriotism. And, the things he was publicly political about tended to just be the stuff that wasn't even thought of as political in his day, just honor the veterans and love the flag. And
how simple is that?
I remember in the 80s, I think there was somebody was I forget, somebody was doing something to the flag at Yankee Stadium during one of the games of the week, and Vin kind of criticized them on the air for that. And Bob Raceman of the New York Daily News went after him for it.
Of course.
Oh, you're jingoistic stuff but it was just it's the flag, right? And my parents never forgave Bob Raceman for that.
He always needed something to complain about.
Yeah, but yeah, no, I thought some of that stuff it pulls together in an interesting way. That there really are so many different sides of the story.
Yeah, I thought Will's point was great to make, because it was if you were going to criticize Vin for, when he said, I'm not going to watch an NFL game anymore because people are kneeling during the national anthem. And I had this discussion with him. Do you know why they're really doing that? And he kind of doubled down, and he dug in, and it's all right, I understand where you're coming from. I just wanted you to know why they're kneeling. And but I think what Will's point was, if you were going to be critical of him, it was more of a poor reflection on us than it was on him. We can't have this dialogue and understand a person of his generation having this strong belief, and why can't we honor that? And so I thought it was important to have Will's kind of comments about that too. It shied away a lot about politics and everything, because that was the great thing about Vin. You didn't know if he was Catholic or Protestant or Democrat or Republican, because it didn't matter. I mean, privately you could know those things, but even then it wasn't such a overbearing sort of thing that made it hard to have a dialogue with him, because it was just, that was the part of the fun about it, was just having these discussions. And I was trying to think of different.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of a piece with the fact that he hated talking about the business of baseball on the air. There are certain things that you don't want to get into on the air.
Well, like he said too, there was a strike of I think it was 81, where you knew that the strike was going to happen, and he was promoting games that were coming up, and he got criticized for that. And he goes, I don't think the people watching the games want to know about those things. That they need some sort of a diversion from that, and so that's what I'm trying to give them. And he was always loyal to the team. That he read the copy, and he was never critical about Chavez or Rabin and all that other stuff that came out, because it didn't matter. It was just he was part of the creation of baseball in Southern California. And if some people might say Sandy Koufax to me is the biggest baseball person in Southern California history, when you think about it, Vin created that image and that iconic part of him. And when you think about the fact that there's two statues in Dodger Stadium now to Jackie Robinson and Sandy Koufax, and people go, when are you going to have a Vin Scully statue? And we have a Chick Hearn statue and a Bob Miller statue, and it's he doesn't want that. It's kind of you got to respect who he is and what he stood for, and he's not about statues and things. But the funny part in Los Angeles is we like to honor people with artwork and creativity. They write songs about them. They put up murals. So there's probably as many Vin Scully murals around Southern California as there are Kobe Bryant murals. And that's the fun part to see, is how people honor him with tattoos and T-shirts and things like that. And it's really kind of, it again makes it feel like a family reverence to this person. Not to build a statue because you want to bow to the statue when you come to the game, but this is how you want to celebrate him.
At Wrigley for a long time in the right field corner is a statue for Harry Carey.
Sure.
And the way they made it, you could put a Budweiser can right in that thing.
Right.
And instead of letting
that's
that be
Harry.
instead of letting that be a great thing, they put a bar. They rolled in a bar across it. Granted, you don't want people climbing up this expensive statue, but
for Chick Kern, the Laker broadcaster, they put him at a desk and you can sit next to him and have your picture taken. And that's just not what you want to have Vin thought of. And I'm glad that hasn't happened, because the Dodgers might say, well, if you do it for him, you have to do it for Jaime Jarrín, who's and it's like, well, yeah, do it for both. But it's like, at a certain point, let's just keep it classy.
But you can, before every game, hear someone say it's time for Dodger baseball.
Sure. And
that I think is a great.
Yeah, his voice is like Walt Disney at Disneyland, right? It permeates the whole atmosphere, and it's what baseball's always been part of nostalgia, and that's a great selling point of the game. But to hear that, it just takes you back in time, and for a stadium like that looks almost exactly the same as it did 60 years ago, that's just a perfect thing to have.
I love it. I appreciate it. I appreciate you coming on. Dan, anything in closing before we wrap this up?
You know what? I'll let Tom have the last word, but I will give one more thumbs up to say, buy the book. It's worth the read. It's a good summer beach read.
I really appreciate it, and any support the family has. I really appreciate the love and the support, and knowing, again, it's not anything that it's not a self-promoting kind of thing. It's really it feels like a group project. It feels like a city project. So anything that happens with this is just perfectly eloquent, in my opinion.
Perfect. Let me do this.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you.